The winter cold of early 1918 bit deep into the bones of Russia, but it was not the weather that threatened to kill the revolution. In the frozen streets of Petrograd and Moscow, where the Bolsheviks had seized power only months before, a different kind of death was spreading, the slow, agonizing collapse of hope itself. The old imperial army had melted away like snow in spring, and what remained was little more than a shadow, a ghost of military order wandering through the chaos of a nation tearing itself apart. Lenin stood in his office, the lamplight casting long shadows across maps that showed a country bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was being negotiated with the Germans, and every day brought fresh humiliation. The Kaiser's armies were carving away vast territories from the Russian Empire, Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland, and there was nothing to stop them. Nothing. The Red Guards, those factory workers and revolutionaries who had stormed the Winter Palace, had proven themselves capable of street fighting and revolutionary fervor, but they were not an army. They were barely organized militias. And now, facing professional German soldiers, they were collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. The soldiers who had fought in the Great War wanted only one thing: to go home. They had been promised peace, land, and bread, and they intended to collect. The famous Order No. 1, issued by the Petrograd Soviet back in 1917, had destroyed military discipline, telling soldiers they could elect their own officers and question their commands. It had been useful for breaking the Tsar's grip on the military, but now it was a curse. Men simply walked away from their posts. They took their rifles and went back to their villages to claim the land they had been promised. The front lines dissolved. Officers who tried to maintain discipline were sometimes shot by their own men, their bodies left in the snow as warnings to others who might think about giving orders. In the small town of Narva on the Estonian border, a unit of Red Guards faced a German advance in February 1918. They had no artillery support, no proper trenches, no winter clothing that could withstand the Baltic wind. The commander, a former factory foreman named Grigory, watched through field glasses as the German infantry moved forward in perfect formation, their machine guns positioned with mathematical precision. His men huddled in shallow pits, their fingers too numb to properly grip their rifles. When he gave the order to hold the line, 3/4 of his unit simply stood up and began walking eastward, away from the battle. They didn't argue. They didn't rebel. They just left. Grigory screamed at them, threatened them, even fired his pistol into the air, but they kept walking, their backs turned to him and to the approaching enemy. Within an hour, the Germans had taken the town without firing a shot. Grigory retreated with the handful of men who remained, and that night, in a freezing barn, he wept with a rage and helplessness that had no outlet. This was happening everywhere, at Pskov, at Dvinsk. At every point where the Germans chose to advance, the Red forces crumbled. The revolution was winning in the cities, in the Soviets and the committees, in the fiery speeches and the printed proclamations. But on the ground, where steel met flesh, it was being annihilated. The Bolsheviks had destroyed the old order, but they had built nothing to replace it. They were like men who had torn down a dam without realizing the flood would drown them too. Inside the Kremlin, the arguments raged. Lenin knew that without an army, the revolution would die. The German armies could march to Moscow if they wished. The White forces, former Tsarist officers, constitutional Democrats, social revolutionaries, all the enemies of Bolshevism, were beginning to organize in the south and east. Foreign intervention was coming. British, French, American, and Japanese troops would soon land on Russian soil, and the Red Guards could not stop any of it. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately, or the Soviet state would be strangled in its infancy. On January 15, 1918, the Council of People's Commissars issued a decree creating the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. On paper, it was the birth of a new military force. In reality, It was a desperate improvisation, a hope thrown into the void. The decree called for volunteers to join a revolutionary army based on class consciousness rather than conscription. It sounded noble. It sounded like the future. But volunteers were not arriving. The factories were empty of men willing to fight. The countryside was hostile, the peasants jealously guarding their newly acquired land and seeing no reason to die for city Bolsheviks who spoke in strange political languages they didn't understand. By March 1918, the situation had become catastrophic. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, surrendering a third of Russia's population and resources to Germany, and still there was no real army. The recruitment numbers were pathetic. Perhaps 50,000 men scattered across a country that stretched across 11 time zones. These men had no uniforms, no standardized weapons, no training and no discipline. They gathered in whatever buildings could house them, often requisitioned schools or barracks, and they argued about socialism while their rifles rusted and their boots fell apart. It was then that Leon Trotsky entered the story like a force of nature, like a man possessed by the absolute conviction that will could reshape reality. Trotsky had been appointed People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, and he looked at the shambles before him with the eyes of someone who understood that revolution without power was just theater, just words shouted into the wind until the counter-revolution came with bayonets. He was a brilliant orator, a theorist, a revolutionary intellectual, but now he had to become something else, a builder of armies, a creator of discipline, a man willing to do whatever was necessary, no matter how brutal, no matter how it contradicted the pretty promises of revolutionary democracy. Trotsky began with a simple understanding. The volunteer system had failed. The romantic notion of a workers' army, held together by ideology alone, was a fantasy. Men needed more than ideas to face bullets. They needed training, leadership, supplies, and above all, they needed to know that desertion meant death. In April 1918, Trotsky pushed through the introduction of conscription. It was a betrayal of the volunteer principle, and many Bolsheviks protested, but Lenin backed him. The revolution, Lenin said, would not survive on principles alone. It would survive on power, or it would not survive at all. But conscription alone would not save them. The real problem was leadership. The Red Guards had no experienced military commanders. The Bolsheviks had spent years denouncing the Imperial Officer Corps as butchers and oppressors. And now those same officers were the only people who knew how to organize divisions, plan logistics, coordinate artillery and infantry, read terrain, and think strategically. Trotsky made a decision that shocked many of his comrades. He began recruiting former Tsarist officers, tens of thousands of them, offering them positions in the Red Army under Bolshevik command. The outcry was immediate. These were the men who had served the Tsar, who had ordered workers shot during strikes, who represented everything the revolution opposed. How could they be trusted? Trotsky's answer was as cold as it was practical. They would be watched. Political commissars would be attached to every unit, Bolshevik loyalists who would stand beside every former imperial officer and ensure their orders served the revolution. And if an officer betrayed the cause, if he attempted sabotage or defection, he would be shot immediately. More than that, Trotsky instituted a hostage system. The families of officers were registered, and their safety depended on the officers' loyalty. It was ruthless, it was terrifying, it worked. Through the spring and summer of 1918, Trotsky became a figure of almost mythical energy. He traveled constantly on his armored train, a mobile headquarters that rolled across the vast Russian landscape, bringing him to the front lines wherever the crisis was worst. The train was equipped with a printing press, a radio station, a telegraph office, and a well-stocked arsenal. It was painted bright red and became a symbol of Bolshevik determination. When the train arrived at a sector, the soldiers knew that someone was paying attention, that they had not been forgotten in the immensity of Russia's collapse. Trotsky would stride into camps where desertion had become epidemic, where men were starving and their morale had shattered, and he would speak to them. His voice could fill a square, passionate and urgent, promising them that their suffering had meaning, that they were not dying for nothing but for the liberation of humanity itself. But words alone were never enough. Trotsky understood that fear could be as powerful as inspiration. He reintroduced military discipline with an iron fist. Deserters were hunted down and executed, often in front of their former comrades as a lesson. When entire units broke and ran, Trotsky instituted the ancient practice of decimation. 1 in every 10 men selected by lot and shot. It was horrific. It was ancient Roman brutality reborn in the 20th century, but it stopped the collapse. In one incident near Sviazhsk in August 1918, a unit of Red Army soldiers panicked during a white offensive and fled their positions, allowing the enemy to advance dangerously close to Kazan, a city whose fall would have been a strategic disaster. Trotsky arrived within days. He ordered the regimental commander and the commissar shot immediately. Then he had several dozen soldiers selected at random and executed in front of the assembled regiment. The remaining soldiers were given a choice: fight and possibly die with honor, or flee and certainly die with disgrace. The regiment held the next line. Kazan was saved. The methods were monstrous, but in that terrible summer they were also effective. Yet even with conscription, even with officers, even with Trotsky's brutal discipline, the Red Army remained on the edge of disintegration. The country was starving, the cities were running out of bread, inflation had made currency worthless. Soldiers at the front often went days without food, living on what they could forage or steal from the countryside. This created a vicious cycle. Hungry soldiers preyed on peasants. The peasants hid their grain and grew to hate the Red Army. And the army grew hungrier still. Typhus swept through the camps, killing men by the thousands. Lice were everywhere, crawling through uniforms, spreading disease that weakened men faster than bullets. The infrastructure had collapsed. Trains barely ran. Telegraphs failed. Supply chains existed only in theory. In a field hospital near the Volga River, a young nurse named Katya moved between rows of dying men, trying to offer comfort where medicine had run out. The wounded lay on straw in a converted barn, their bodies burning with fever, their eyes glassy and distant. Some called out for their mothers, some prayed to saints the revolution had officially abolished, some simply stared at the ceiling and waited for death. Katya had been a factory girl before the revolution, bright-eyed and full of hope for the new world. Now her hands were stained with blood that wouldn't wash out, and her dreams had narrowed to getting through each day without collapsing. When a soldier died, and several died every day, the body was carried outside and laid in a growing pile behind the barn, waiting for someone to dig graves that might never be dug. The revolution had promised a better world, but here in this barn, the world was only suffering. And yet, somehow, the Red Army did not fall apart completely. It bent, it cracked, it nearly broke 100 times, but it held. Partly this was due to Trotsky's relentless energy and will. Partly it was due to the political commissars, those ideological enforcers who kept the soldiers connected to a larger purpose, who read them revolutionary literature and reminded them they were not just fighting for survival, but for the future of humanity. Partly, it was due to sheer necessity. Many soldiers had nowhere else to go, their villages had been destroyed, their families scattered, and the Red Army, for all its dysfunction, offered food and shelter, however meager. But there was also something else, something harder to measure. There was a kernel of genuine belief among many of the soldiers and officers that they were building something unprecedented, that despite the horrors and the hunger and the death, They were midwives to a new kind of society. This belief could be found in the young communists who volunteered as commissars, throwing themselves into the work with a fervor that bordered on religious. It could be found in the workers' brigades who marched to the front singing revolutionary songs, believing they were defending not just Russia, but the international working class. It could be found in the speeches and the banners and the red stars painted on their caps. Ideology, it turned out, could be a weapon too, more durable than steel when wielded correctly. By the autumn of 1918, the Red Army was beginning to stabilize. It was far from a professional force, far from the mighty war machine it would eventually become, but it was no longer on the verge of complete disintegration. The conscription was bringing in numbers, hundreds of thousands of men, then millions. The former imperial officers were beginning to integrate into the command structure, their expertise combined with Bolshevik political control. The supply situation remained desperate, but organizational improvements meant that food and ammunition were reaching the front more reliably than before. Most importantly, the Red Army had learned to fight. In the brutal crucible of the Russian Civil War, facing white armies, foreign interventionists, anarchist bands and nationalist movements, the Red Army was being forged through blood and necessity. The threat remained immense. The white armies in the south under Denikin, in Siberia under Kolchak, in the north under Yudenich, all were well equipped, often supported by foreign powers, led by experienced generals. They won battles, captured cities, came close to strangling the Soviet heartland. The Civil War would drag on for years, killing millions, devastating the country beyond recognition. Famine would come. Terror would escalate on both sides. Villages would be burned, prisoners massacred, atrocities committed that would haunt the survivors forever. But the Red Army did not collapse. It survived its own birth, survived the chaos of 1918, survived the moment when it seemed nothing could possibly hold together. And in surviving, it became the instrument through which the Bolsheviks would ultimately win the Civil War. Trotsky's methods, conscription, the use of military specialists, political commissars, brutal discipline, would become the foundation of the Soviet military system. The armored train would roll across Russia for years, a mobile symbol of revolutionary determination. The young men who learned to fight in those terrible months would become the commanders and marshals of future decades. In later years, Soviet historians would portray the formation of the Red Army as inevitable, as the natural expression of revolutionary consciousness. They would write of heroic workers spontaneously organizing to defend socialism. They would downplay the chaos, the failures, the near-death experiences. They would rarely mention the executions, the hostages, the brutal necessities that Trotsky employed. The official story would be clean and triumphant. But the truth was messier, more desperate, more human. The Red Army almost never existed. It came into being through improvisation and terror, through the force of will of men like Trotsky who were willing to make horrible decisions, through the suffering of millions who had no choice but to fight or die, through a combination of ideology and fear and sheer luck that somehow, against all probability, did not break apart in that frozen winter of 1918. Those who survived would carry the weight of those months forever. They would remember the cold, the hunger, the friends who deserted, the comrades who were shot for cowardice, the villages they burned, the enemies they killed, the ideals they clung to when nothing else remained. They would remember standing in the snow, wondering if the next day would bring death or simply more suffering, wondering if the revolution was worth this price, wondering if anything could be worth this price. And in their memories, often unspoken, often buried beneath official narratives and propaganda, lived the truth of what it meant to build something new from the ruins of the old, that it required not just hope and courage, but also ruthlessness and sacrifice. That revolution was not clean or easy or beautiful, but dark and bloody and desperate, and that the Red Army's survival was not a story of inevitable triumph, but of men and women who held on when letting go would have been easier, who endured because surrender meant extinction, who paid a price so terrible that it would echo through generations. The revolution survived. The Red Army was born, but it was born in agony, and that agony would shape everything that followed.